A couple of weeks ago, I put out a video that showed you all of the new contrast paints and compared them to a few of the existing range. A few of you asked me to do the same with the new range of shades too. Fortunately, Games Workshop also sent me the whole shade range along with the contrast paints. So in this video, I'll be going through all 12 of the new formulations and comparing them to their old versions. In addition to this, I'll also be showing you the 7 new shades that the line is being expanded with as well. I'll be using the same Sancta Mechanicus bases sprayed with the new white scar paint that I used in the last video. This will give them the most neutral base coat and more easily allow me to show off the colours of these washes. But before I go on, there are just a few caveats to this demonstration that I'll address before they get left down in the comments. First of all, I'm not a machine. So while I'll be using the same brush and base for each wash and striving to use the same technique, it will be inevitable that some washes are applied slightly different ways or amounts, which will potentially affect the result. Secondly, I have received these paints for free, so it's understandable if you feel that there is a bias, but I'll try to be as objective as I can. I'll be making everything as visually clear and consistent as possible, so feel free to ignore everything I say and judge the results for yourself. Finally, some of the older formulation paints that I'm using are just that, old. They've been open for a while and have been used to varying degrees, which may or may not impact their effectiveness. However, I did use an unopened pot of Beal10 Green, and in comparison to my other washes, didn't seem any different to it. So with all that being said, let's take a look at these new shades. I'm starting off with some new Nuln Oil on the left and comparing it to some of the old Nuln Oil on the right. I'm applying the wash quite heavily, probably a little more so than I would do my own paint jobs, but this should help to emphasize the differences and make them a little more visible on camera. Straight off the bat, the new formulation seems to be slightly more viscous. It's not quite as thick as contrast paint is, but the new medium is definitely a little less runnier than the old mix. As a result, the wash stays in the bristles a little more, rather than immediately being wicked away onto the surfaces. It does require a little more work to apply the wash, but it doesn't just completely flood the surface quite as much as the older one does. But even though the new wash is a little thicker, it still pulls away from the surfaces a little more effectively, and doesn't seem to pull up quite as much on those flat areas. In terms of the colour, it's very much identical, which isn't too hard to achieve for a black tone, but it's still good to know that your old and new paints will still match up, at least for the most part. Once the washes have dried, you can see that the new formulation appears to pull far less than the older washes, and so has fewer surface stains. The recesses, on the other hand, are almost identical in their shading, which of course is the main reason for using washes. Next up, we have Agrax Earthshade, but rather than just rehashing the same points that I made about Nuln Oil, I'll keep quiet for a bit, just to let you see how the application and the results go on for the next few washes yourself. So while the new shades have been pretty consistent with their colours so far, Drakenhof Nightshade is the first to have a slightly different tone. Drakenhof is already a greyish blue, but the new formulation appears to be ever so slightly less blue and a little more washed out than its predecessor. I'm not entirely sure why this paint is different compared to others. It could be an interaction between the pigment and the medium, or an intentional change. Either way, the difference is subtle, but maybe don't switch to the new wash in the middle of a project. Fleshshade is another one of the shades that has a very subtle difference in tone. The old Reikland is ever so slightly more pink, whereas the new one leans into the brown a little more. It's not a huge difference, and it's probably hard to tell when not applied directly over a white base coat, however. Once the wash had dried, it was also easy to see that the old Reikland also had a little more surface staining than the new one. Again, it's subtle and unlikely to be noticed when applied over flesh tones, but there is still a difference, however slight. Next up is Fugen or Fuegan Orange, and while the tone between the old and new is the same, the new is far more transparent. The wash left me with a much more washed out look compared to the more intense orange of the old. This wash probably has the biggest difference between the new and old, and is probably something you'll want to hold off on if you're in the middle of a project. Finally, we have Katsandori Yellow, which was always my favourite from Games Workshop's Shades range. As such, when it came to apply this paint, I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was pretty much identical to its original. Good news if you've been following one of my old Imperial Fist tutorials. And with all of that, the existing range of shades have been looked at. Now it's time to check out the 7 new shades. Poxwalker is the first of these, and as its nurgly name suggests, it is a green. In terms of its shade, it's kind of a pale sea green. It probably sits somewhere between Beal Tan Green and Quelia Green shade, but it is more translucent and therefore lighter than either one. It's a wash that would make good for similar green shades like Cabalite or Sybarite Green. Model uses that immediately come to mind are Sylvaneth Tree Revenants, Ghosts, and the skin of this particular Poxwalker. Another green in the new range is Croak Green. This is a warmer yellowish green. Its closest existing wash is the Thonian Camo shade, but Camo shade has more brown in it, making it like an olive drab. Deathworld Forest, Elysian Green, Deathguard Green are all good examples of the colours that Croak Green would complement nicely. By extension, besides the obvious uses over your Deathguard, you could tackle some Crypt Ghouls incredibly quickly by applying this over a white or grey base coat. Targor Rage Shade is a great name for a paint, but its colour is an unusual shade. It kind of has this reddish grey effect and is similar to what you get if you mix together some non-oil and Caribou Crimson. Being a more washed out and paler shade, you're going to only really be able to use this over paler base layers such as whites, light greys and tans. Zombie Skin is a use that comes to mind most readily, but it would also work well for that greyish red skin tone that a few of the Blades of Khorne characters have as well. Following the Khorne theme, Berserker Bloodshade is next. In the past, I've mixed together Caribou Crimson and Reikland Fleshshade to add some reddish hues to my skin tones, and Berserker Bloodshade is pretty close to what this mix looked like. I used to use this mix around scars, wounds, and facial features to add a little variation to skin tones, and the shade would work just as well for those too. Tyron Blue refers to the ocean world of Tyron, and as such its colour is the first true blue shade that we've had so far. Drakenhof has always been darker and more grey, but Tyron is much brighter and much more vivid. This means that your brighter blues won't be dulled down quite as much as if you'd used Draken Nightshade. The bright blues of Tzeentch models are good uses for this, but it would also be perfect for achieving that subtle blue tint of the Grey Knight's silver armour. If you're looking for some really subtle shading over white or bright grey areas, then Soulblight Grey fits that role nicely. It doesn't add any colour and it's not quite as dark as Nuln Oil, so it keeps your white surfaces looking bright while also still adding a little shading. The armour of the White Scars or the hair of the Daughters of Cain are obvious choices, but it could also work as a kind of shade medium. As it lacks any colour, you could mix it into the stronger hued washes to create a more subtle shading effect with them. And that brings us to the final shade, Mortarion Grime. It follows a similar theme to a few of the other washes in this new range by being an in-between shade. It's a pale tan with a slight green hue, placing it between Seraphim Sepia and a Athonian Camo shade. If you're tackling a light tan or a white and either of those washes are a little too strong, then Mortarion Grime is a good alternative. As the name suggests, it can be used over a white base to achieve the pre-heresy grimy white armour of the Death Guard. Alternatively, it can be used to create a slightly rotten, slightly mossy bone effect for your Soulblight skeletons. So, we've looked at the paints over the bases, but how do they look on miniatures? Well, I've actually snuck one of these into my recent Dark Angels tutorial, and I've also made use of them in an upcoming Emperor's Children guide. I used Agrax Earthshade over the metallics on my Dark Angel to achieve a grimy effect. Nuln Oil was applied to the steel areas in my Emperor's Children guide, and Reikland Fleshshade was used over the gold details and the skin as well. In all of these cases, I found the washes poured less on the surfaces and more into the recesses, which is exactly what I want from my shades. Now that we've looked at all the paints, compared them to the old versions, and checked out the new colours, what's my verdict? Well, I definitely think that the new shades are an improvement over the old. I never had an issue with the old formulations, but these new paints do flow a little better than they used to. But should you dump your old paints and buy all new? No, not at all. The difference isn't that great, and your existing range of shades will do the job just fine until they run out, or until you knock them over. But that does bring me to one point of contention that I have with the new range. The old 24mm shade bottles cost £4.75, and the new 18mm shade bottles also cost £4.75. This means that the new formulations cost about 6p per milliliter more, which doesn't sound all that much, but that's nearly a third more expensive than the old. Is such a price hike worth it? No, probably not. The new paints are an improvement, but not enough to warrant a 30% increase. So my advice to you is to go out and pick up some of the old 24mm shades from your FLGSs while they still have them in stock. The price increase does put a bit of a dampener on this new range, but if you don't mind the extra price or you're eager to try out some of the new paints, then I do have some affiliate links to where you can pick up some for yourself at a discount. A big thank you to everyone who watched to the end, and while I have taken a bit of a detour to review paints recently, normal kit bashing guides will resume shortly. But if you have been enjoying my look into these paints, leave some suggestions for other paint ranges you'd like to see me do some comparisons between. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to those who make these videos possible, my wonderful patrons. Currently my top supporters on Patreon are Brushlicker Nim, Jonathan Hart, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, and Sweatsman. A big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon through channel membership or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourself that allow me to fund the tools and paints required to create these videos for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.